Hello, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to the New York Public Library. Please silence your cell phones. My name is Salvatore Scibona. I'm the Weinberg Director of the Cullman Center for Scholars and Writers here at the library. As some of you know, the Cullman Center selects 15 fellows a year for a 9-month term. Fellows receive an office in the center, access to our collections, and a stipend so they can focus exclusively on their work during their fellowships. The fellows are some of the best and most promising academics, independent scholars, poets, playwrights, journalists, dramatists, artists, and fiction writers at work today. They come here from around the country and the world to use the unparalleled collections housed at this library to write the enduring books of tomorrow. The Cullman Center was founded in 1999, and we have just bid farewell to our 26th annual class of fellows. We are open for new applications as of a few weeks from now. The application season is between mid-June and roughly mid-September. So if you know a talented writer who would like a year at the library, let them know. This series of conversations presents the books that the fellows came here to write. Tonight we help launch the new book by Barbara Demick, Daughters of the Bamboo Grove, From China to America, A True Story of Abduction, Adoption, and Separated Twins, which she worked on during her 2020-2021 fellowship at the Cullman Center, where she was the inaugural Janice B. and Milford D. Girton Arts and Letters Foundation Fellow. In its review of last weekend, the New York Times calls the book entrancing and disturbing. It continues, quote, "Demick is one of our finest chroniclers of East Asia. She hammers together strong, solid sentence after strong, solid sentence until the grandeur of the architecture comes into focus. Demick's characters are richly drawn, and her stories, often reported over a span of years, deliver a rare emotional wallop." And the Times of London writes, "Demick is written with impeccable empathy for everyone involved, Chinese and Western. Despite the author's limited Chinese, she captures the essence of rural Chinese society in a way few Western observers have done, while her portrait of Americans, very different to herself, is sensitive and sympathetic." Barbara Demick will discuss her book with nonfiction writer and past Cullman Center fellow Jessica Bruder. After about 35 to 40 minutes of discussion, our presenters will move on to your questions. If you'd like to pose a question, please write it on the index card on your seat. Staff members will pass along the outside aisles to collect your questions in about 30 minutes. This event is being live streamed on YouTube. If you're joining us virtually, please share your questions either in the chat or by emailing cullmancenter@nypl.org. That's Cullman, Cullman, center@nypl.org. Copies of Daughters of the Bamboo Grove are for sale in the hall, and Barbara has agreed to sign your copy for you after the presentation. She is joined this evening by Jessica Bruder, the author of 3 nonfiction books, including the New York Times bestseller Nomadland, Surviving America in the 21st Century, which was translated into 24 languages and adapted into an Oscar-winning film. A New York Times notable book and an Editor's Choice selection, Nomadland also won the Discover Award and was a finalist for the J. Anthony Lucas Prize and the Helen Bernstein Book Award. Bruder is working on a book about mutual aid and abortion access. She was a fellow at the Cullman Center in 2023-2024 and teaches at Columbia Journalism School. Our friend Barbara Demick's previous books are Eat the Buddha, Life and Death in a Tibetan Town, Lugavina Street, Life and Death in a Sarajevo Neighborhood, and Nothing to Envy, Ordinary Lives in North Korea, which won the Samuel Johnson, now Bailey Gifford Award, and was a finalist for the National Book Award and the National Book Critics Circle Award. Demick was based in Beijing for the Los Angeles Times from 2007 to 2014, and in previous postings covered Korea, the Middle East, and Eastern Europe. Please help me welcome Jessica Bruder and Barbara Demick.
Thank you so much for coming out tonight. I don't know how many of you have been here before, but I'm thrilled to be back. And if you're thinking about applying for that fellowship, oh my God, do it. Anyhow, it is a delight to be here with Barbara. Her book is entrancing. I'm still ensorcelled by it. It's here on my lap. Recommend it. And I'm really stoked to speak with her about it. So one of the things you should know about this book is there's a journey and a meta journey. because the story of how Barbara found the book is so intrinsic to the book itself that I think I'm just going to ask her to start there.
Thank you, Jess, because it's very hard for me to say what the book is about without explaining the journey. But it started in 2009 when I was a correspondent in China for the Los Angeles Times and started reporting on families, poor families, whose children were taken away by government officials because they were too poor to pay the fines for violating the one-child policy, which I think we're all familiar with by now. And I went to some of the poorest regions of China, crossed streams, hiked up goat paths. I mean, these were people who were remote and without connections or education. And one of the families I met in there had twins, twin girls. You know, before you think it's too innocent, they actually had more kids. They were trying to have a boy, and they had 2 more girls. But they really wanted to keep their girls, and they, tried to sort of hide one with relatives, and it didn't work. The girl was taken away. So this, as I said, started in 2009. I met the mother and this 9-year-old girl who said, I miss my twin. Can you bring her back to me? And I was like, probably not. But, I wrote a story. And, it evolved from there. It was about from 2009 to 2019 when actually I did bring her back.
You did.
I did.
Which is one of the reasons your journey is so integral to the book. But before we get in further, can you talk a little bit about the one-child policy, which, as you alluded to, is not as simple as that name for it might suggest. I did not know, for example, that one could pay a fee to, actually have another child. So it makes me, think that there were some rules for some and some rules for others. And can you tell us more?
Yeah, there were some rules for some and some rules for others. And it was never a one-child policy. It was some people were allowed another baby if they had a girl first. If you were like a military hero, you could have another. But this was like the face of repression in rural China from 1980 onward till 2015 when it was lifted, and it was just intrusive in the extreme. A friend of mine wrote about factories where they had the period police. You had to show your bloody napkins every month to prove you weren't pregnant. Amazing things going on. And if you violated the rules, you could be, dragged out at 8-9 months pregnancy and, forced to abort. We talk about reproductive rights here, but it's sort of the same thing in a way. It's, control over women's bodies. It was very, very brutal. And people were terrified. And this was, as I think some of you know, Chinese history. Well, this came after the Cultural Revolution, the Great Leap Forward, these other misadventures of the Chinese Communist Party. But this one really, well, they were all bad, but this one really affected a lot of people, and it's still affecting a lot of people because China has this population bust. They don't have enough people, they don't have enough kids, and it was just really last fall that they stopped allowing adoption abroad. But you have, all these young men who can't find wives. Some places there was sort of, 130 boys for every 100 girls. And it's been kind of a disaster. And it's kind of a funny thing. I mean, not really funny, ha-ha. But this during the height of the one-child policy, these vigilantes were, deputized to go around and terrorize people, including taking away the babies, tearing down houses, dragging people off for forced abortions, forced sterilizations. And now the same people are still employed, but they're encouraging people to have more births. It's just, I mean, I hate to overuse the Orwellian, but it's like we've always been at war with East Asia. It's like, oh, it's always been like this. We need more babies. So it's still intrusive now, and they're like knocking on doors asking women why they're not having kids.
And it's like the same thing in a way in terms of control, right? I mean, when you say period police, I instantly think of Nicolae Ceausescu's Romania, where they also had the menstrual police who would check on people in factories. But again, to the opposite aim. They did not want abortions. They considered the fetus the property of the state, which is kind of wild, and orphanages were full of children. So yeah, there are just so many parallels.
Yeah.
It's wild. There was one thing you mentioned, that it was a common name for young Chinese girl.
Zhao Di, want little brother. And I actually met one of these Zhao Dis when I was interviewing families who had girls, that they would name the girl, I want a little brother. But, I mean, one thing I would say is, okay, there were girls who were abandoned and thrown away, but I think at that point, the 80s and the 90s, people would not have abandoned their daughters except under duress. I think most people wanted to have a boy and a girl. That was the ideal family. And when you start to study the history of adoptees, you realize that most of them had older sisters. They were second or third or fourth daughters.
Sure. So and the whole idea that all these people were abandoned. I mean, your book puts the lie to that in this situation. Can you tell us a little bit about the abduction?
Yeah, this whole phenomenon of kids being confiscated by families planning started around 99, 2000, and it was very interesting. It's we call it supply chain problems. There were all these abandoned kids, and then suddenly everybody wanted to adopt a Chinese girl. There was always been a very large demand in the West for healthy babies without fetal alcohol syndrome, and these were basically healthy babies, and there just weren't enough. And so at that point, this whole mechanism kicked in where people were kidnapping babies or trafficking babies to get into the lucrative adoption market, and this was really being done on a local level. So there was this weird thing where families who were adopting had to make a $3,000 donation to the orphanage, cash, $100 bills, clean bills, please. And that money was kept by the orphanages. These were government orphanages, and that was like a lot of money in rural China. I mean, it's a lot of money, $3,000, but it was really a lot of money in rural China, and that money was sort of keeping local government going and keeping the orphanages going. It was all, this slush fund. And when they didn't have enough babies, they had to take them. And I've heard, I didn't put this in the book because I couldn't confirm it, but I saw orphanage employees were putting, this was online, that, you had to keep your job at the orphanage. You were responsible for bringing in one baby a year. And so that's
a baby quota?
Pardon?
There was a quota.
There was a quota. Baby. So this particular, we're asking about this particular baby, the twin. So this family tried to separate the twins to make them less noticeable and left one with an aunt and uncle. And this is, again, a very remote village. You couldn't drive to this village. You had to walk there. And, they came in, though, and, they kept on visiting the house and spying on the house, and they came one day when the aunt was home alone babysitting, and they were like 10 men, and they overpowered her, held her arms and legs, and grabbed the kid, 2 years old, almost 2 years old.
Didn't her, I guess, her cousins try to get her out the back window or something?
They had come a couple times, and the first few times these young boys who were babysitting her, like sort of snuck out a back window, and they just like went much faster than the Communist Party bureaucrats. But eventually they took her, and they claimed they wanted this much money, that much money, this and that, but they didn't. She was transferred into an orphanage right away, and within about 6-7 months, was adopted by a family of evangelical Christians in Texas. Right?
Who thought she'd been abandoned at like the gates of a factory that made
bamboo.
Thank you.
Bamboo, which was funny because she was actually born in a bamboo grove. That's from the name of the book. The mother was trying to give birth secretly, so
there was that little shack in the bamboo grove.
Yeah, it was a shack in a bamboo grove.
Yeah.
Where she gave birth, and I think especially after 2000, maybe 10% of the kids were taken or given up under some kind of duress. There's kind of a continuum of duress. She was violently taken. Some cases, people were tricked.
Yeah, I remember you writing about people signing things that they couldn't read, being made to sign things that said they consented when no such consent had been given. And just the level of vigilantism, like didn't they punch a hole in the roof of this family prior to...
Oh, yeah.
And that was mild compared to what were some of the other things the vigilantes did to people?
I mean, they demolished houses, they dragged people out to be sterilized and to have vasectomies. There was one case in the village where, like, a guy who was just married was forced to have a vasectomy. They had these quotas, and it was a very brutal policy. And I mean, one of the reasons I wrote about this was not just about the children, but the one-child policy was really a reflection of what life was like in rural China. And actually at a time when things were much better, people were getting wealthier, they could travel, they were allowed to be, to be migrants. Well, they couldn't completely relocate, but they could work elsewhere. They had a lot of freedoms. But, when it came to your personal life and sex, completely regulated.
And the number of family planning officers was just huge, too.
It was bigger than the People's Liberation Army. Because all these people were deputized, and it was like when the Chinese Communist Party wants to do something, they do it, and this was their core policy.
And if your town failed, wasn't there some not punishment or like funds withheld? There was some
yellow card. The yellow card, you'd get a yellow card, and none of the people in the village, the little cadres would be able to get promotions or raises. I mean, it was really serious.
So informants everywhere.
Informants everywhere.
Even in the bamboo grove.
Even in the bamboo grove, yes.
The bamboo is listening. We had an interesting time earlier talking a little bit about people who both came out of more traditional news, where you would never use the first person, lest people think you are a narcissist. Like, what are you doing there? We know you're writing the story. But in a story like this, and in work I've done, sometimes you get into situations where it would be such a silly bit of choreography to leave yourself out because people are reacting to you, things are happening that wouldn't otherwise happen, that you kind of can't wear the black clothes that stage technicians wear and move around the furniture in the theater anymore, which is kind of what I feel like traditional news are doing. It's like, we know you're there. We can even see you. But okay. I don't see you. It's like a little kid hiding, right? And it's like, I don't see you. You know exactly where the kid is. But so you had to, come out into the spotlight a bit, and I wanted to ask you, and that's one of the great joys of the book. I mean, we get to ford the streams and traverse the goat paths with you on your quest. And you are, in some ways, I think, the proxy for the reader, and more. But I'd love it if you could talk a little bit about realizing you had to be a part of this story, and in reporting it, I don't want to do the double question things. There's some moments where you can't be a direct conduit between both families, and it was like painful to read, just thinking about you not being able to share all the information with everybody. I mean, can you talk a little bit about what it means to go that deep?
Yeah. Thank you. It's true. You see this weird construction, some stories. So-and-so told a journalist.
I hate that. It's so pretentious.
What journalist? Yeah, I've always written in the third person. I'm kind of bashful, a little bit bashful. You know, I don't like to write about myself. I'm private anyway. But I became very involved in this story. So actually the first part of the book is all in the third person. I'm not there at all. I'm conspicuously absent, which is the case in my other books about Tibet, North Korea. I am not there. But then I enter the drama because, so I interviewed this family in 2009, and I got back to my office in Beijing, and my friends know that I like to fiddle around on computers. It's like a good way to procrastinate. And
We talked about that too.
we talked about a lot of things. So I had this idea, like maybe I could find the missing twin. And this was sort of like a triage thing, because I had met other families who had lost their kid, but this girl was a bit older. She was about 2 years old, which is like a year older than other adoptees. And I knew what she looked like because, you know, I had met the 9-year-old version of her. I knew she was a twin. And I had a pretty good idea of which orphanage she went to. So I started like fooling around on these Yahoo bulletin boards, and people were, you know, always like posting pictures of their kids. Oh, you know, riding a pony, you know, ballet lessons, gymnastics. People are proud of their kids. And there was one family, evangelical Christians from Texas, who had actually started a little NGO called Adopt the World. This was a big evangelical thing. Adopt as many kids as you possibly can to save these abandoned babies. It was a whole thing in the early 2000s. A very good book written about it called The Child Catchers. So they had posted these pictures, and you know, she looked like the right kid, was like the right timing, the right size. So I made what I would call like mug shots. I cut out these little pictures of the photos the family posted, and the photos, I just took random photos of Chinese baby girls and toddlers from the internet. And I pasted them on a piece of paper, and I sent them to the family in Hunan and said, you know, these are like some adopted kids. Do any of them, but perchance, do any of them resemble? You know, I don't know. They got back to immediately, and they picked out the correct 2 pictures. And it was like, wow, like no doubt. They were really sure about it. And then I was like, you know, holy shit, what have I done? Because, I mean, honestly, I feel bad about this because I don't think I had thought enough about the psychological implications for real people. I was like, you know, sort of self-congratulatory. And there was a moderator of this chat group who wrote to me and said, you know, this family is really grieving. The father had died the year before, and, you know, they can't cope with this. And I mean, I had no intention of writing anything because this was, you know, a 9-year-old. I couldn't just out a 9-year-old girl. So I took the stuff I had and I mailed it to the family, and I said, don't worry, I'm not writing anything. And I contacted the Chinese family, and I said, you know, I think she's in good hands. She's with an American family. You know, you can't contact her now. They thought she had been trafficked for her organs or some crazy urban legend. And, you know, that was it. Life moved on. I had other books, you know, covering China was exciting. And in 2017, a member of Esther's family contacted me and said, you know, our girl is a teenager and she wants to meet her twin and her birth family. And that's really where I came in. And as is, you know, maybe this comes up in like the third part of the book, but eventually I did bring her to China over Lunar New Year to meet her identical twin and her birth parents.
But so she couldn't talk anymore. So
She couldn't, and it's been very frustrating for Esther. She has what's actually a universal phenomenon known as infantile amnesia. It sounds bad, but it's like everybody has it, and most people can't remember anything that happened before they're 3 or 4 years old. And I think she has more memory loss than some others. Probably.
So all that fledgling fluency also just got wiped out.
Got wiped out completely.
Which makes it extra moving to see them playing the hand games and just kind of communicating how they can.
Yeah, and it's been, I mean, actually a lot of this story is about social media because, I found her on social media. Nowadays, people find each other through DNA testing, and we did confirm with DNA testing, but I found her through social media. And actually, I found these stories through Chinese social media. I mean, just going back to the period of the early 2000s when I was reporting in China, it was social media was rather new in China. There was like this QQ was a bulletin board, and the censorship was not as developed as it is today. So things that were happening in these remote villages, we would find out about. And, even in a village where everybody is illiterate, there'd be one person who had a cousin who was in the city who was educated, and they'd put something on social media, and it might get, scrubbed by the censors, but we were constantly looking. My Chinese-speaking staff was, as the Times of London said, my Chinese is not very good. But the staff was like constantly looking for these stories, and that's how these stories about people whose kids were taken away came out. It was a very kind of, innocent and open period when, we really thought of social media as a tool for good and democratization. But anyway, going back to I'm losing my train of thought, but how they contact each other from the beginning, when I connected them, they got on this app, WeChat, which is like just the universal app in China. It's like everything rolled into one, and it has a translation function, not very good. So they can, text each other, and the twins are not as close as I thought they would be. They went through sort of a cooling off period, but Esther texts her birth mother frequently. And again, there's a literacy issue and a language issue, but there's a lot of photos and emojis. And, it's interesting because the relationship has sort of ebbed and flowed with the U.S.-China relationship in some ways. After the reunion in 2019, we had intended to do for Shuangjie to do a return trip to the U.S. And, well, we know what happened at the end of 2019 and early 2020. COVID, everything was shut down. And by the time it opened, then the situation now, there's like no chance that she would get a visa for the U.S. So, these estrangements at the national level also, trickle down to people.
We'll have Q&A from the audience in just a second, but can I ask you, has Esther read the book?
Yes.
And?
She's excited but a little bit nervous. I'm going to talk to you a bit about Esther, but she is a very talented photographer. She's a wedding photographer now, but she's really good. She has a great aesthetic sense. We were in Paris together a couple months ago, and she took fabulous photographs. So she kind of wants to be known as a photographer and not as like the stolen child. So she's adjusting to it.
Stolen child photographer.
Yeah, it's funny because this other, everybody is different. This other adoptee who I wrote about for the New Yorker, it was a story that ran Friday. It was about another adoptee who was taken from her family. She's just like, I want to be on TV. I want to blah, 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 blah. But Esther's not so much like that.
Got it. So, but she's read it. Did she react to any specific passages or?
I don't know that she's read it.
Oh, I thought you said she'd read it. You
No,
don't-
I
you
mean,
don't know.
I gave it to her.
Sure.
I've given it to her at various stages, and she said she was going to read it, but I haven't heard.
Wow. What were you two up to in Paris?
What does one do in Paris?
You were flaneusing around? Or?
Yeah, it's kind of a story, but it was just, I mean, I was like, eating and drinking coffee, and she.
But
was
wait, why were you there?
Yeah, she was going to like 5-6 museums a day. She's like a real artist in her way.
So wait, this was just like a fun trip you two planned together, or how's the?
Oh, it's like a long.
Okay, sorry.
But no, well, it's there's this weird thing where, as journalists, you can't pay your sources. So I paid for a lot of the trip to China for the family, and then I was going to Italy last year for some book stuff, and I had like 5 extra days, and I had frequent flyer miles. So I said, Esther, you want to come to Italy with me? Which she thought about for about 2 minutes and said yes. And we had a great time, and she said, where should I go next? She had, really never been to Europe. I mean, she'd never been anywhere but China. She said, where should I go next? And I said, Paris. So then she invited me to Paris, and I said, well, you're not paying for my trip, but we did go to Paris together.
That's really sweet.
Yeah. I mean, we were talking about this because Jess and I earlier, because we're both in touch with people we've written about. I mean, I'm in touch with everybody in my books, if they're still alive.
I mean, also, when you do immersion journalism, you're around when things happen to people. And things happen to you, even if you're trying to pretend that they can't or won't or don't.
Yeah.
So when you've been through it together, the story continues. Wow. Sorry, I'm just thinking about you two in Paris, and that's really quite sweet.
Yeah. But it was, something that I really wanted to add in here.
Please.
Is at the time... there's a section of the book that's about really identity and twins, and what does it mean that you have these genetically identical people, one is Chinese and one is American, and it raises questions. What makes us Americans? What is different about us? And at the time we went to China in 2019, I really felt like the Chinese twin was in a better position going forward. Just China was very, go. The economy was booming, and she was living in Changsha, the capital of Hunan province, which is actually a really nice city, great food, and was, working as a sort of teacher trainee at a kindergarten, and had this whole career path. And Esther was like doing nothing. Esther was homeschooled, so she has very little, really proper education. But then between China and the U.S., and there's a limit to how much you can look at, just these kids and what do they represent. But, then COVID happened. Shuangjia's kindergarten closed down. Then really all the private kindergartens closed down because Xi Jinping didn't want people going to private kindergartens. And Esther, I think, really had this, what I would call, can-do American confidence, even though she's not rich and she's not educated, and she's, doing very well as a photographer. And, I saw that a certain American attitude that, really put her in good stead. And, so I found the two of them very interesting.
Yeah, and you talk a little bit in the book about twin studies and, trying to pry apart nature from nurture, even though, of course, each case is singular. And it's kind of hard to do.
Yeah, and China versus America. And it's like how much,
I mean, that's
like
the nurture.
One set of twins, but there's interesting things about them that way.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. All right, the cards, please.
I think there's some more cards here.
The card, please. Do the top one because it looks good, and then I'm going to peruse because I realize if I sit here and read them all, that's not very interesting. If I sit here and read them all to myself, because we probably don't have time for all of them. So can you please talk about what it was like to work on this during COVID and being essentially stuck in New York?
This must be somebody from the Cullman Center, because this is my shout out to the Cullman Center. I don't know what would have happened if I wasn't a Cullman fellow, but I was here for 2020, 21, and I had intended to go to China to finish the reporting on this. I obviously could not do that. I had intended to read books at the Columbia East Asian Library. I couldn't do that, but I was here. The library was closed to the public, and really only the Cullman Fellows were here. And some days I was like the only fellow at the library because I was trying to escape children and cats and the chaos in my apartment. And so I'm very grateful to the Cullman Fellowship because I basically read books about demographics, about Chinese history, procrastinated a lot, but it was a lovely place to do it. And I really could get a lot of books from the East Asia collections through the New York Public Library, so it was a lifesaver. So thank you, Paul and Sal and Lauren. I think I saw you back there, Cullman staff.
Indeed. Interesting. Since all twins violate the one-child policy, were all or most sets of twins separated from 1980 to 2015?
No. It was legal to have twins. This family, to be honest, this was a typical young couple. Got married, they had a baby, it was a girl. They had another baby, it was another girl. They really did want to have a boy, so then they had 2 more girls. So they really were in violation of the policy. I don't know. There may have been cases where twins were separated when they were the first births because, like, of the children who were confiscated, there were all sorts of reasons. They weren't all multiple births. There were couples who hadn't legally registered their marriage, which a lot of people didn't do because it was a lot of bureaucratic paperwork. And in the countryside, you got married, you had a party, drank some wine, and you were married. And they had their kids taken away. There were, varying age requirements for having babies, and sometimes the couples were underage. Sometimes, they got pregnant and decided to get married, but they didn't have an advance permission to give birth. So I think there are a lot of twins among the adoptee population. I thought this was the only case that I had heard of one who is American, one Chinese, but I've just heard about another one that was just discovered. And there are, twins who've been adopted to separate homes. So they're out there.
We have a lot of great questions, so sometimes I'm going to Frankenstein 2 together.
Okay.
Because, so on reactions from the Chinese government, any reactions after the article, after the book, and also any reactions or resistance about just the reunion of the twins in general?
I've gotten... I actually didn't get much reaction from the Chinese government. When my story appeared in 2009, I really didn't hear anything, but something strange happened there were Chinese I think I was the first foreign reporter. Well, some Dutch had reported, but it was the first in the American press. But there were Chinese reporters who were way ahead of me, but they hadn't been able to publish because, they were told the one-child policy is core national interest. You can't write about it. So they were sitting on these stories, and actually some of them leaked information to me. But after my story came out, it made enough of an impact overseas that they were able to write. And this is like a kind of a symbiotic relationship that we had between Chinese journalists and the foreign journalists. If they couldn't get something published, they'd leak it to us. And then once we wrote it, they could cover the ensuing scandal and they could get the story out. So we'd get the credit, but it was their work. And once their stories came out, this whole saga was a cover story in Saixin in 2011, and then it got a lot of attention. And some of the family planning officials were punished and kicked out of the Communist Party, which is a big deal. On the national level, it was a local scandal. I've got to say, I did not find evidence of corruption in Beijing at the national government level. This was local officials doing it. So it's not been as sensitive as some other things. In terms of reaction, the reaction among adoptive parents to the original stories was just horror, because these people thought they were rescuing abandoned babies, not being end consumers in what was an increasingly abusive system. And people were really upset. And, I think the adoptive parents, actually a lot of the adoptive parents felt like this was the most ethical way to adopt. That, they didn't want to be, picking up babies from impoverished families and other places, that this was a unique situation because of the one-child policy. So there was a lot of horror on those parts. In 2009, things have changed. In 2009, most of the adoptees were quite young. Now, most of the adoptees are young adults. I'd say the largest number are in their 20s. And I've gotten an incredible, incredible reaction from them, from those who've seen this book and those who read the New Yorker article, because they were always told, you were thrown away by like garbage. This was the narrative, and it was convenient. We rescued you. This was the whole rescue narrative. And I think psychologically it was very damaging. And of course, in some cases it was true. I mean, girls were discarded, but I think in most cases they were discarded under pressure. I think most people would not have given away their daughters, even if they were second, third, or fourth daughters, unless there was the pressure from the one-child policy.
Just thinking about the emotional fallout, you mentioned that on TikTok, the New Yorker post about this story went completely viral.
Yeah, I had a piece that ran in the New Yorker on Friday, and they did excerpts of it on TikTok, and it got 6.7 million views, which is a lot for the New Yorker.
I didn't even know the New Yorker was on TikTok.
I know, it's like weird in so many ways, but a lot of, I've gotten like so many messages from adoptees that, and the piece is about birth families looking for their children in the U.S. and, just realizing that their Chinese parents were not monsters, and, just that the whole story they were told, which was, very detrimental to their sense of self-worth, was not necessarily true.
And on the other side, people thinking that their babies had been, organ trafficked. That's terrifying.
Yeah.
All right, ethics. We've got 2 on ethics. Did you think much about the 2 girls in the intervening years, and did you worry about ethical concerns? And after considering all the ethical dimensions and the outcomes, would you get personally involved in a story like this again?
Good questions. So the ethical questions came up very, very almost immediately, because as I said, in 2009, when I located the stolen twin, I thought I really should have, considered more carefully what I was doing. I was doing a favor to the Chinese family, but it had to do with like me, just setting a challenge for myself, honestly. And I realized I didn't meet the family in Texas until 2018. They contacted me in 2017, and I met them in 2018. And I spent a lot of time with them, and I realized how difficult the whole thing was for them. Esther, they found out about it immediately. There's a whole section on how that happened, but Esther found out about it when she was 9 years old, and she was really scared that she was going to have to, be sent back to China, that somebody was going to come and get her. And they were already girls. I say the girls because she also has an older sister who's an adoptee from China. They were already kind of isolated as homeschooled kids, and they just got really scared.
Didn't they build like a huge privacy wall?
Yeah,
they
they built a privacy wall, and they said it was because there were druggies in the neighborhood. I don't know. It's hard to say, but it was when I visited them. The curtains were always drawn. They were very, very, very private. And so I think it was, I felt like I had caused some harm, truthfully. I started connecting the twins, and really at that point I didn't have any expectation of writing anything. I was also like on deadline with another book, a book about Tibet. But I connected them. I set up a video chat between them, and then that was it. That was it. And then when I went to see them in 2018, the mother, Marcia, said, "Do you think you could help us go to China?" And they had no money. They had no money. We were talking earlier about Jess's work about middle class people who get sort of kicked out of the middle class. The adoptive parents had both worked for Lockheed, and the father got lymphoma and died, leaving the mom with 2 young kids. And, it was just a typical American story, not quite enough health insurance, not enough savings, not a big enough pension. So, they were quite broke. And Marcia, was a single mother. And I said, yes, I could give them advice, but what they wanted was, somebody to pay for the trip. And I said, if I do that, I would really have to write about it. And, it's like up to you, because I said I would like to write about it. I mean, of course I wanted to write about it, but, I wasn't going to. And they got back to me, and, that it was the trip, truthfully, was magical. Everything fell into place. My publisher provided some money. The LA Times provided some money. My uncle provided some money. I provided some money. I got cheap tickets on China Eastern. Everybody got visas. And it was like the trip was, LA Times paid for the car and the interpreter. And, it was great. And I think Esther, because I talked to her pretty often, was very happy. She felt that going to China and meeting her birth family just kind of liberated her in a way. And I saw professionally and creatively, she's really taken off since then. I can't say it's due to me or the trip or what, but she's done really well.
All right, these are all really good questions. So are you ready for a 4-question speed round?
Yes, we have 6 more minutes. So.
Okay, really sweet. It's funny. Usually the great thing about cards is you can like filter out comments and just do questions, but sometimes the comments are so sweet that they're awesome. Yeah. So somebody in the audience who from China greatly appreciates that someone like you can cover this kind of topic because it's hardly written about and published in China. Thank you. Question on that is also, with the current China internet scrutiny, will you continue to report on China?
What?
With the current internet scrutiny in China. Will you continue to report on China?
No. It's not like the internet scrutiny, but I'm not reporting on China right now. I don't know if I could. I had a visa that expired a couple of weeks ago, and I don't know that I'm going back. And to be honest, this period when I was reporting, 2009, 2008, June, you were there. I mean, it was a very open period. It was really, after the Beijing Olympics, which were summer of 2008, the government had promised to give journalists more access to the country, and we just like tootled around everywhere. We got hassled some, but it was really a great privilege and wonderful to report. And especially going into the countryside, people were so nice and so grateful. They would say like, oh, welcome foreign journalists. You can report things that the Chinese press can't report. And the Chinese press would leak things to us. And it was a great time. It's not like that now. And I left China in 2014, although I continued to travel through 2019. But I just think it got harder and harder to report, and there are very few American journalists now based in China.
Okay, speed round. How did evangelical Texas family feel about connecting daughter with birth family and going to China?
The Texas evangelical family was great, and I'm talking about the mother, Marcia. And I was, I think this is a friendly audience, I'll say. I was very nervous to meet Marcia because I'm a single mother and a secular Jew, and this is to me like Hunan province was more familiar to me than rural Texas. In fact, when I was driving to meet them, I was driving from Waco, and I was listening to Shit Town on NPR. Did you ever hear that? But it was just, I was just this like New Yorker in Texas, and Marcia invited me to spend the night, and she was just like couldn't have been warmer and more welcoming. And the next morning, she said to me. We were talking, and I said, I'm a single mother. I've never been married. And she looked at me, and she said, honey, I'm a Christian, not a saint. And it was like, we were like, okay. She also loathes Donald Trump, loathes him. And she was, are there any Trump supporters here? I'm sorry. I don't want to offend you. Maybe, because I don't want this to be a political thing, but she considers Trump to be the Antichrist, and she was kicked out of her church for not being a Trump supporter, so she doesn't go to church anymore. But she is, she's a good Christian, she's an evangelical, and, at the time I wrote the stories in 2009, I was kind of appalled about this adoption because she and her husband were in their 50s when they adopted, and they had no money, they had health problems, and I thought like, whoa. And they had this NGO, Adopt the World, save the abandoned babies, but she just turned into, she was a great person, and she was really supportive of her daughter. And when I think about it, when her daughter was 9 years old, she was right to say, don't write anything about it. She waited till her daughter was ready. So I'm still very close to Marcia. And I tell you, to be anti-Trump in rural Texas, it takes a lot more courage than being anti-Trump in Manhattan. So.
All right. Unfortunately, we have to wrap. The last two questions were half answered, but if the other halves...
Oh, sorry about that.
No, it's not your fault.
Yeah.
I would love to keep going. But one of the great things about this book is that saint quote, which I love, is in the book, and all of these complicated dynamics that may defy your expectations for all sorts of stuff. It's a wonderful book. I hope you'll check it out and have her sign it for you. You can also ask the other halves of questions just out front. But could we please get, well, thank you for coming. So could we get a round of applause both for you, pat yourself, and Barbara.
And for Jess. Thank you, Jess.
And that's it.
That's a wrap.
That's a